Welcome to Indus Special. I'm Ejaz Haider. Before the advent on the scene of President Donald Trump, it was easier to figure out the US foreign policy. Post-Soviet Union, it was not only a unipole moment, but it was also a world of, to quote John Mearsheimer, liberal dreams. There was space here to build the rest of the world in the US image. Dictators were to be ousted, the natural and inalienable rights of everyone, everywhere were to be restored. That one might have to wade through rivers of blood was a price to be paid for the world that needed to be built. And this is exactly what Daenerys Targaryen says in the finale of the Game of Thrones, talking to Jon Snow, and she says, "We can't hide behind small mercies. The world we need won't be built by men loyal to the world we have." And Jon Snow says, what we need is a world of mercy. It has to be. And she says, it will be. It's not easy to see something that's never been before, a good world. And Jon Snow says, how do you know? How do you know it will be good? And she says, because I know what is good. For good or bad, that moment couldn't become an episode. The unipole moment is gone for the most part, and the liberal dream has collided with international realities. So what do we have now with President Trump in the Oval Office? We're going back to the old interstate rivalries for sure. Balancing is again the order of the day, but there's much that's new too. It's a digital world. Its rules of communication have undergone a sea change. Are we witnessing the historic march of realism into a world that is largely unknown? What's in store for Sapiens? To discuss this, we have with us Ambassador Mathew Bryza, former US diplomat based in Istanbul, Professor Christian Kaunert, who's chair of policing and security at the University of South Wales. And we shall also be joined by Dr. Moeed Yusuf, Associate Vice President, Asia at the USIP. Ambassador Bryza, what kind of foreign policy are we looking at? As I said, the liberal dreams have collided with international realities. Are we back to good old structural realism, or are we looking at something else, something about the US under President Trump wanting to go back to isolation?
I think we're looking at something else. President Trump seems to favor that old world based on raw realism. He seems to be against the sense of collective security, a sense that the United States is better off when all of its friends and allies are better off, which is the founding set of principles of the so-called Bretton Woods institutions, like the World Bank and the IMF, that were supposed to help everybody grow wealthier, which would be serving U.S. interests. President Trump doesn't seem to appreciate that historical record, and it may be simply out of ignorance, out of never taking the time to study history. And instead, having had his formative experience as being that as a real estate developer in rough and tumble New York City. Unfortunately, that his message of rough and tumble, America first, forget about collective security is resonating with a significant number of American voters. But I think there's also a backlash that's beginning against President Trump overall and against that approach. And where I draw a lot of hope is actually in Europe, where a whole new form of civic activism seems to be being driven by high school students, led by Greta Thunberg, for the support of protecting the environment against climate change. And by the way, that movement resonated in European parliamentary elections this last week, where it was pro-environmental ideas, not only in the Green Party, but elsewhere, people who want to fight climate change, who seem to score the biggest victory, even more so than the far-right forces that are Eurosceptic and are more raw realist.
Correct. But we're looking at various strands here. Europe itself, as you clearly know, and I'm sure you're observing very closely, there is the rise of the far right wing. There is a sense of growing nationalism, Euroscepticism. We have, of course, the Brexit blues in the UK and the rest of it. So the US used to take the lead. But if President Trump wants to sort of go back into the continental sort of, shelf, what do you see? I mean, how would the rest of the world cope with it? The regional tensions, there's the rise of China, the US is taking a certain kind of policy stance towards that, which, as you know, the structural realists say, well, this was inevitable and it's going to inevitably lead to some kind of clash. So we are looking at multiple strands. How do we identify what are the dominant strands here?
So, yeah, I mean, the predominant strands are the ones I think that you articulated. There's a significant portion of European and U.S. societies that find simple answers to complex questions appealing. And those are the nationalists and Eurosceptics. You know, there are many people on both sides of the Atlantic who feel that the paradigm we seem to be moving toward that you described of a world coming closer together, playing by agreed rules, in shorthand, globalization. Many people feel that they were left behind by that as new groups of people benefited from globalization, but at the same time, as wealth became increasingly concentrated in a narrow number of hands, I mean extreme wealth. So these are the big strands, I think, out there. Yes, nationalism reflected in populism, which is a quest for simple answers to complex questions. That's sweeping the globe, as many people feel that globalization has not benefited them. So at the same time, there are grassroots groups and people who are increasingly concerned about the environment, about reversing global warming, and at the same time that geopolitically there's such a contest going on between the United States, Russia, China, Iran, even Turkey. And to me, the key challenge is going to be how these domestic strands interact with these geopolitical ones in a moment when the United States does not appear to want to lead, as you said, when instead President Trump prefers to conduct a transactional form of diplomacy that aims to isolate individual countries, even friends like Mexico, like our European Union allies, to get the best possible short-term deal for the United States. That's a lack of global leadership, which reflects an ignorance of the reality that these contests, negotiations over trade or geopolitical challenges, they're not one-offs. If you win today, you're still going to have to negotiate with those parties tomorrow, but in a situation in which so much trust has been lost. So those are the trends, and we need someone to be leading to rectify those trends and find common outcomes, or find outcomes that are for the common good. But the U.S. isn't leading that charge now.
Okay, yeah, well, that explains quite a lot, but also raises other questions. Let me be a little more specific here. Assuming, we know that President Trump said that I won't get out of Syria. He's already said he wants to get out of Afghanistan. But while he wants to get out of Syria and get the U.S. out of the greater Middle East, he has also, he walked out unilaterally from the JCPOA. He's been putting a lot of pressure with primary and secondary sanctions on Iran. And now, of course, there's been this sort of war rhetoric. How does his trying to get out of certain conflicts square with his rhetoric about getting into new ones?
That's a great question. And President Trump's foreign policy is indeed filled with contradictions if you look at it from a traditional foreign policy perspective. Another one is, how does he rectify his desire for lower oil prices at a time where he's reimposed sanctions on anyone buying Iranian oil? So many contradictions. I think in his mind, how this all makes sense is that he cares most about negotiating deals, a one-off agreement with an isolated partner or competitor. And so his tactic is to turn up pressure, to maximize pressure on that negotiating partner or competitor in the hope that they will back down. And as he's turning up the pressure, then sometimes he passes the ball to people like Secretary of State Pompeo or National Security Advisor Bolton, who recently have been, again, putting a lot of pressure on Iran, for example. But then President Trump himself seems to contradict them and says, well, I'd like to talk to President Rouhani. So it's a good cop, bad cop approach that attempts to make President Trump the good cop who can rescue the other negotiating partner from all that pressure the rest of President Trump's team is applying. The problem is that approach has not been successful. It's led to some short-term openings, let's say in North Korea, where there were negotiations twice, as we know, with Kim Jong-un, which led to nothing.
As a matter of fact, Russia and China have gotten back in a big way into that space, especially when Kim went and met with President Putin, and then President Putin was going to Beijing to talk to the Chinese. So, do you think that this is, since you've mentioned, for instance, the oil prices and how does that go with putting pressure on Iranian oil sales? Does he understand, or his team understand, that this is like things are interconnected? And if you are trying to just do one thing, it becomes like that parlor game, the whack-a-mole game, where putting one mole down and another mole is popping up, and then and they keep popping up with a speed that ultimately you lose the game.
That's a perfect analogy. And I think that's precisely what's happening. I think his team does understand the need for a coherent foreign policy. I think there is a whack-a-mole thing happening. And I think his team tries to untangle all of these contradictions and would like to have a coherent policy process. But I think the president himself does not see those interconnections. And he has a national security advisor who, instead of playing the traditional role of the coordinator of all the various U.S. government agencies to come up with a common approach, John Bolton has instead ended that coordination process, which I was a part of for 4 years. We had a very, an intricate set of meetings, tens of meetings by senior officials 3 days a week to try to come up with this coordination. Ambassador Bolton has pretty much ended that approach, and I think that's because President Trump, in the end, doesn't really trust the so-called experts, but trusts his own instincts, thinking he's such a successful self-made man. So it's a combination of arrogance and ignorance on the part of President Trump that leads him to distrust knowledge. And when you distrust knowledge, then it's impossible to have a coherent approach.
Absolutely. Ambassador Mathew Bryza, all great to have you on the program. Thank you so much for your insights. Professor Kaunert, this discussion so far, would you agree with the sense that there's not much policy coordination when it comes to President Trump's team? And most of those who have tried to sort of, shall I say, educate him, are actually not part of the team anymore?
Right. I think to an extent you can see some of those trends if you look at individual policy decisions. But I think with President Trump, you want to look at a big whole, the entirety of his foreign policy. And if you look at the entirety of his foreign policy, of his geopolitical approach, what you see is a systematic deprioritizing of American interests and a systematic favoring of Russian interests. It is very clear, and the kind of Mueller investigation pointed at significant evidence that Russian policymakers have influence on President Trump. And if you actually see some of his key foreign policy decisions, you will see that Russian influence in pretty much all of those key foreign policy decisions. If you take, firstly, the decision to alienate pretty much most of European allies of the United States, all of that plays very strongly into Russian geopolitical interests because it basically withdraws America increasingly from Europe. It antagonizes some of the key allies of the United States, whether that is Germany. Germany has been one of the prime targets of his geopolitical focus. If you look at Great Britain, the Prime Minister of Great Britain, Theresa May, was one of his other great key targets. All of that, in the end, favors Russian political interests because it basically provides space for Russia to extend its influence across the continent. And also his very strong focus on supporting Brexit, and in fact not just Brexit, but supporting a hard Brexit that would seriously undermine the alliance between the European Union and Britain. The main beneficiary of that policy, again, is Russia. If you look at his key foreign policy decision to pick a fight with China, again, one of the key beneficiaries of that foreign policy, again, is Russia. So if you look at pretty much all of his foreign policy decision, one common denominator is a favoring of Russian interest over American interest.
Okay, so what we see is that the American establishment, the traditional part of the establishment, shall I say, the intelligence agencies, of course, the Pentagon and others have been fairly, in a way, vocal about Russian intentions and the fact that Russia is slowly trying to march into its previous Soviet Union sort of near abroad. So you see a tension between how the establishment wants to play it and where the president is going.
Absolutely. There's a very, very strong difference. The traditional American establishment, of course, understands the key foreign policy interests of the United States. And the key foreign policy interest of the United States is to be as close as possible with its traditional European allies. That is what has made American power over the last century or so, if you look at its core. Now, if you take then the reverse approach to fall out with your European allies, you are actually weakening America's standing in the world, and you're opening space for other actors such as Russia to move into that very space and to form closer alliances with those very European partners that used to traditionally be American allies. If you think about the whole debate in the European Union about having a independent European foreign policy, European army, all of that can be seen as a direct outcome of Trump's foreign policy. There were suggestions of talks about this before, but Trump's foreign policy has really accelerated this to an extent that we've never seen before. So we can really see American influence in Europe weakening, and every geopolitical decision strengthening Russian foreign policy interests in Europe.
Okay, let me pull in Moeed Yusuf. Before you joined, we were talking about the fact that there was a unipole moment post-Soviet Union, and there was a liberal approach to human rights. You oust the dictator, you get everyone their inalienable and natural rights and all of that. But it seems that moment, that liberal moment, is also gone because it has collided with international realities. And now we have President Trump, who seems to be doing very contradictory things. I was earlier asking Ambassador Bryza about how do you square the fact that we want to get out of Syria and then want to start another possible conflict in the Middle East with Iran. So you watched the Inside the Beltway scene very closely. How do you look at it?
You have a nice tie on for a change.
For a change?
Yeah, for a change.
Okay.
I think, just to be very honest, the Cold War was heavenly for international relations scholars. Neat as ever, you got two camps, you can analyze everything so clearly. You're with one or with the other, where do the smaller powers fit, etc. The unipolar moment upset that a little bit. But then you got into this routine of the US being the only sort of hegemon in the world and going out, and then you saw 9/11, then Iraq, etc. So it was an interventionist, forward-leaning policy, if you will, forward-based policy. I think President Trump has come and pulled that back. When you mention Iran, you're reading what I'm reading. I don't have any more information on this, but it's pretty clear that he is not the one who was looking for a new conflict. In fact, he's been very clear that he just doesn't see the value of being out there doing this, not because he feels that there is mayhem and it's not working. It's more because he says it's a homeland issue. Just come back inside your borders, figure out immigration, become less lenient on that, and deal with things internally, and let the world deal with its own mess. I mean, that sort of is Andrew Jackson in some ways, if you go back in US presidential history.
Yeah, the two strands, the Jacksonian and the Wilsonian
That's
strand.
correct. And you want to pull back and you want to come in. Now, he has his own style of doing things. So what you're not going to find is neatness in analysis, neatness in analogies, and neatness in how things are coming together. It's more chaotic.
No, but if he doesn't want to get into this conflict, and we were talking about this earlier, and Ambassador Bryza thought that this was like a good cop, bad cop routine, then why walk out of an agreed multilateral deal, the JCPOA, and then not just walk out of it, but also slap very stringent primary and secondary sanctions?
Yeah, because I think there's a consensus that Iran needs to be holed up, isolated further, brought to its knees. I mean, I think on that, there's no debate. I mean, remember when President Obama got this deal through, it was very unpopular. I mean, he had to sort of, get his veto powers in and sort of threaten everything that he could. And still, it was a very unpopular deal. It wasn't, didn't go through comfortably. So if it were ever going to be a right-wing president, I think President Trump or anybody else, I was pretty sure that you would have a problem with JCPOA. This one, of course, has been done in a different way. As I said, he has a different style of doing it. I think getting Iran in the dock further, whether it's at the behest of the US or Israel or whatever it is, was a consensus point that was going to happen. And I actually think it's worked. Look, I mean, Iran is isolated by the US, but the Europeans haven't stood up at all in the JCPOA. The Saudis...
No, but they can't really. I mean, they tried to, for instance, bypass through, they have this special purpose vehicle, which they call Instex. But that doesn't really cover...
No, but that's the point. So basically, it means that the strategy has worked. Iran is in the dock. And my own sense is Iran will have to renegotiate on JCPOA because it has nowhere else to go right now. I mean, you've seen the Iranian foreign minister go around the region, capital to capital. What did he get? I mean, this very difficult moment for countries.
I was talking to some Iranian policymakers on one of my programs, and they said that Russia and China have been helping them out, and they will continue to help them out. But of course, at the same time, they also conceded the fact that the economy is under tremendous pressure and the pressure is mounting.
Help how? Look, I mean, the point is this is well known. There's no hidden secret. UAE used to be a base through which banking channels were used. Of course, if a country is isolated and completely sort of cornered, they are going to use these means to get out. But the fact of the matter is, look at Iran's potential and look at where things are. I mean, these are serious sanctions. The economy is hurting. Yes, it is true that I don't think...
So are you saying that through this, President Trump is, and he's talked about, wanting to talk to President Rouhani, although President Rouhani himself is under tremendous pressure from the hawks, because they're saying, well, we told you that you don't need to sit vis-a-vis from the Americans because they want to walk out. Let me pull in Professor Kaunert here. Professor Kaunert, do you think there's a method here whereby Trump is sort of incrementally increasing pressure and thinks that he will be able to get the Iranians to renegotiate a nuclear deal?
I think certainly that is his thinking. I think he's certainly believing that if he isolates Iran, eventually Iran will give greater concessions, even though it's not entirely clear whether any Iranian leadership would be able to give greater concessions and that were already on the table. So that is by no means clear. But he certainly believes by cornering Iran short term, that he would be able to get greater concessions. And I think that is his methods in a lot of the different conflicts, that's for sure.
Do you also agree with Dr. Moeed Yusuf that, during the Cold War, of course, it was great for international relations scholars because everything could be neatly pigeonholed or categorized, and that we are now in a world where it's become extremely difficult to actually sort of identify neat categories?
Absolutely. I mean, during the Cold War, we lived in an era of a bipolar world where it was very clearly you were on one side or you were on the other side, and you could really be easily categorized. We are in a change of transformation at the moment. The world is really at the cusp of a very significant transformation where, for the first time, potentially, the world's greatest superpower, the United States, might eventually be surpassed by a new world superpower, that is China. Now, this comes in a particular moment where we have a number of other significant players out there as well, such as Russia, such as the European Union, and to an extent Britain, that is increasingly setting itself apart from Europe, and of course then Japan as a marginal player as well. So we have a much more multipolar world than we had during the Cold War, where we had bipolar world, and after the Cold War, more of a unipolar world. We're entering a phase of a multipolar world. A multipolar world, if we go back in history, is also one that is much more inherently unstable. It is much more open for potential wars, for conflicts, and any mistake could lead to fatal consequences. And I think that's the kind of world we are at the moment approaching. That's the kind of transformation that we're going to witness over the next 20, 30 years, where we're going to see that increasingly, that any kind of mistake, foreign policy mistake, can have very serious consequences.
Professor Kaunert, since you also work on policing, let me take the opportunity to ask you, I'm sure you've noticed the increasing sort of militarization of the idea of policing, especially with reference to counterterrorism and the rest of it. Does that concern you? Do you think, is that a good trend, or is it something that needs to be walked back?
Yeah, I mean, traditionally, we had this very sharp distinction, right, between internal and external security. The police was primarily dealing with internal security, and the army primarily with external security. Now, we've seen this blurring between internal and external security for at least 20 to 30 years, right across the world, in fact, in Europe, but also in the United States, in Russia, and a lot of different countries. Now, if we look at significant security threats today, now a number of them are geopolitical in nature, for instance, cybersecurity. However, the implications of that security threat tend to be domestic. Now, that's where you clearly have a friction between internal and external security, and therefore police forces, in a sense, have an obligation to act as another dimension within the geopolitical apparatus, because without them, it's impossible to detect the geopolitical threat that powers nowadays are finding, and as a result of that, it is the unfortunate nature of the world that we live in today that policing involves increasingly also dealing with geopolitical threats and not only the traditional community crime.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Professor Christian Kaunert, speaking with us. So we're going to take a short break, and at the other end of the break, we'll continue with our discussion of U.S. foreign policy. Welcome back to Indus Special. We're discussing the U.S. foreign policy, especially given how President Trump approaches it, and the fact that the world is moving from what was known to things that are not entirely known, whether it's the artificial intelligence, whether it's how the cyber world is going to unfold, what kind of threats. Some of the threats we already know about, but there can be other threats that are unknown. I know that you don't read fiction. I also know
You're
that...
accusing me of something? Okay.
No, I am not. I'm just saying.
Okay.
And surely you are also very unfamiliar with this TV serial called Game of Thrones.
I am entirely familiar with it.
Oh, you are?
Absolutely.
Oh, that's great. So I actually mentioned some lines in my introduction from the finale, where Jon Snow and Daenerys Targaryen are having this sort of final conversation before he plunges a dagger into her heart. And I was talking about the fact that this was the kind of, when you say that I know what is good. And when he says that there are others who say that they also know what's good, she says, well, they don't get to choose. So that was the kind of world that we saw. That's what we saw, the chaos in Iraq, elsewhere, and the rest of it. You think that world is finally over? That moment, or call it an episode, or call it what you will?
First of all, if I don't read, I imbibe a lot of fiction, because your industry in Pakistan, i.e. the media, that's all you guys provide. So thank you. I don't need to read anymore.
That's just...
80% of what you see on TV is fiction.
Go on.
I think if you're talking of the moment as it happened, you know, the anomalies called Iraq and this and that, that is over because of the outcome. That is over because it didn't work, right? And so if sanity prevails, you don't want to keep making the same mistakes, you come up with new mistakes. And so yes, I mean, in that sense, I think, but Iraq happened and then Libya happened. Now, it's a different modus operandi, but at the end of the day, some didn't learn at all. Yemen happened. So, I'm not sure you can say it's over, but I think it's clear that it didn't work. And so these big invasions, I don't think will happen. And that's why I've always felt that this Iran idea, it's really gunboat diplomacy. I don't think it goes beyond that. And as I said before the break, it's succeeding. I think because Iran is really cornered, and that's really what it was getting to. Other than that, the chaotic part of global foreign policy, if you will, when the unipole actually becomes chaotic or difficult to read, then the rest are going to be in the same space. Because you can't read them, you don't know what reaction the Chinese are going to give every time, what reaction other countries are going to have. Just today or yesterday, we talk a lot in this country about US-India coming together and whatever. They've just taken away their preferential treatment.
That's typical Trump.
But look,
he said you didn't give me the access to the markets.
I've been saying this, and including on your program perhaps, US foreign policy under him is issue by issue. It is not like, dislike. Yeah, of course there are likes and dislikes in every, but it's not India, everything, Pakistan, everything. You could be doing 5 very good things, very positive things, and suddenly something will come out of nowhere.
But this is specific to Trump.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. So the current foreign policy, it's a very quid pro quo, it's a very transactional. We keep saying it shouldn't be transactional. This is transactional across the board.
Absolutely. But tell me, are we looking at 2 strands in the sense that there is the old establishment, the old players, the sort of traditional determinants of US foreign and security policies? So there, with the rise of China, you have the Pentagon and the policymakers talking about an Indo-Pacific command, pulling India into that and making India a strategic partner. So that is one strand. And then there is another strand which is Trump-specific, where he says, you haven't given me access to your markets the way I wanted you to, and therefore I'm going to do this.
Yeah, I mean, to some extent, yes, because I think if what you call the old establishment, they wouldn't have slapped through this trade measure just because of the markets. At the same time, I think both in some ways are Trump as well, because there is no contradiction, I think, in that framing on working with a country very closely on one thing, but then not giving them what they want on the other if there's not a quid pro quo. So these quid pro quos are broken down, right? I mean, trade is one basket, the Indo-Pacific is another basket. So I don't think there's much of a contradiction in how that is approached. I think here, again, I would say most countries say US is pro or anti. And I would argue it's break issues down, don't lose opportunities in spheres where you do have convergence just because on other issues there are divergences. And India is actually learning the hard way, even Iran, right? I mean, this idea that India used to get exceptions, the exception doesn't matter anymore. The Indians are voluntarily saying no because their commercial interests, the businesses, the oil tycoons, they're not interested. They don't want to touch it because it's too uncertain. So at the end of the day, it comes back to the same thing.
This pro and anti thing, this reminds me of a great line by someone that both of us know and respect deeply, Professor Steve Kaunert. I remember I interviewed him, this is back in 96, 97, and he said, when I go to India, they think I'm pro-Pakistan because I've written a book on Pakistan Army. When I come to Pakistan, they think I'm pro-India because I've worked there and I wrote a book on. He said, no one realizes that I'm only pro-Midwest. So the point about, but the question here is, how should we approach this Trumpian US? Because by going closer to China, or even more close, we've always been close to China, and with also openings to Moscow, there seems to be a sense among the policymakers that, well, if things are not really working right with the US, that doesn't really matter. We have the space to play other actors.
One, I think that's completely wrong. I don't think you can say that the world's only superpower to date, it doesn't matter what the relationship is. But second, I actually don't think that's the view. I mean, what I pick up, at least in terms of the policy circles, is that there is a very serious interest in making sure that the US relationship does not tank. And I think that's exactly the right approach. In fact, the Chinese, more than anybody, have been telling Pakistan for years, do not go into this us versus them, because we don't want to be in a situation where we have to, fight for you, essentially. And so I think Pakistan does want a relationship. I think there have been a lot of attempts behind the scenes. The problem is Afghanistan is so front and center in the US calculus. You can't get away from that. And there is more divergence than convergence, always has been. Now, there was a momentary convergence.
But hasn't, there's been a convergence in the sense that,
on the peace talks.
Yeah,
but the peace talks are stalling, not because of Pakistan, but because of the Taliban and the Doha sort of conversation, right? Ashraf Ghani and the various complications there. So now the issue for Pakistan is, Pakistan's done what it can to bring these guys. It's still not moving, then what's Pakistan's utility? And if the other side is saying, well, unless this gets fixed, we won't talk on other things, you're in this catch-22.
Doesn't the other side understand, that's my sense, because Ambassador Khalilzad, when he went to USIP and after the rounds, he said two things which were significant. One, that the Pakistanis have actually come through on this. They've got these Johnnies to come and sit across from us. And the other thing he said was that our job, and he was talking about the United States, is to finally take it to the point where the Afghans can sit down and work it out among themselves. Now, this is also exactly the position that we've taken. We will facilitate the talks, but what happens there is not something that we can work out.
Yeah, but the second part is not happening. There are a lot of complications. Elections, are they going to happen? Are they not going to happen? Ashraf Ghani is now pro-US or not pro-US? Is he looking after himself more than anybody else? If you're going to bring in an intra-Afghan dialogue, the Taliban say they don't want to sit with the government. I think that's too dogmatic a stance. I mean, somebody has to talk to somebody. That's not moving. Now, the conversation about violence still remains. They don't agree to a ceasefire. When violence occurs, Pakistan gets the blame because of the conversation that's been happening. And so, in a lot of ways, I don't think there's much left in the Pakistani kitty to deliver. I mean, at the end of the day, but at the same time, the blame will keep coming. That's unfortunately the narrative.
Assuming that this thing works out, some kind of modus vivendi, it works out, they start talking. So with Afghanistan sort of removed from this US-Pakistan equation, what else is there to keep them together?
Well, the conventional wisdom is that the biggest point of divergence disappears, and then you get into a more normalized relationship. Business, there's sort of the region, there could be other regional connectivity is an issue, and then there are a number of bilateral issues that you work on. My view on this is actually the polar opposite. I actually think Afghanistan has been the problem, but also what keeps the relationship so serious.
That's my view also.
Right?
Yeah.
And so, logically, if you think of this, I mean, I'm not going by any information, but logically, if you think of this, it's US-India versus China-Pakistan in the grand scheme of things, as people internalize it. What people miss sometimes is how deeply negative the perception of Pakistan in Washington is. I'm not debating it's right, wrong, should be, not. The point is, when people have to make a decision, remember Charlie Wilson's wars, right? I mean, after all the effort, $50 million was the ask to keep the relationship going in some ways, couldn't happen. There's so much fatigue there that people are, probably going to say good reasons. This is over, let's move on and do something else. Now, that's why I keep making the point. If the US-Pakistan relationship has to keep going, what Pakistan has to work on in Washington is its perception. And what the US has to work on here is to make sure that people understand that the US is not completely in India's camp and against Pakistan. Neither one of those I see happening, to be honest. And so my sense is everybody's going to wake up one day and say, Afghanistan done, good or bad, enough. We are done, we need to do something else. That's what shouldn't happen, because my view, it's public, it's made me very unpopular. US and Pakistan, if the relationship breaks, will come back together under much more difficult circumstances, and they'll regret this. Yeah. So one shouldn't go in that direction. But I can tell you with complete conviction that in Washington, this is suicidal. If you're going in this direction as an analyst, it's suicidal. You're immediately declared to be an apologist for Pakistan and this and that and whatever.
Okay, so at the broader geopolitical level, India is a strategic partner. But increasingly, over the last 2 years, and I'm sure you must also have come across all these reports and analyses about India's societal transformation under the Modi RSS combined. Now Modi is back in the driver's seat, and his primary team are all RSS people. We have already witnessed what they do in terms of their Hindutva vigilantism. Now, the US has a very pronounced liberal streak as far as its foreign policy is concerned. If things begin to go south in terms of, more attacks on minorities, Muslims, Dalits, Adivasis, the rest of it, you think that the larger geopolitical sort of strategic partnership will still be in play, or would it come under tension, or what?
I want to say three things. First of all, the India-US relationship has never been as seamless as people make it out to be here.
Agreed.
There have been a number of problems. There will remain problems. No alliance is natural or unnatural. I mean, it's interest-based, and there are still many, many issues because of the Indian bureaucracy, because of many things that hasn't worked. Remember the agonizingly difficult nuclear deal negotiations, right?
Where the US was trying its level best to somehow, get the Indians.
And you hear this very regularly from friends in Washington that the India relationship on a day-to-day level is very frustrating. Right? Yeah. So that's one. In fact, Pakistan's actually spoiled some of the habits because it was a sort of rollover for most of its history. That's one. Second, what happens to India internally? There's no question, unfortunately, it's very clear that India is in trouble. I mean, there's going to be this more sort of tension around within the society. When that happens, I don't think it's about the US liberal streak or human rights or whatever. Internally, the market will start becoming more uncertain, more unpredictable, and more difficult to manage. When that happens, the investors will start looking elsewhere.
Absolutely.
Right? Once that happens, you will have more human rights conversations and all of that. The same kind that used to happen before India's economic transformation. This is all interest-based. That's how it happens, right? Yeah. The same Pakistan during the Cold War was the darling. Yeah. Didn't have too much of a different track record on many things, right? That's the second one. The third thing is important. As I said, it's issue-based. So you shouldn't rule out a possibility where US and India are very close and working hand in glove on certain issues and not close at all on other issues. For instance, China will bring the US and India together. There may be many other issues where not. So for Pakistan, again, I think, if I were doing this, I would argue, look at the convergences, cash in on those, the divergences will remain, they will be where they are. If it's an all or nothing Afghanistan kind of mindset, Afghanistan is there, something happens, Afghanistan not there, it's over, then I think the relationship will break. And at least in Washington, I keep arguing, this is going to be, pushing Pakistan in China's camp voluntarily makes no sense for the US when you're trying to actually keep your camp as strong as possible. For Pakistan, or anybody in Pakistan to think that, oh, there's China, we don't know the US, I think it's crazy.
Okay, finally and very quickly before I wrap up, in the event that Trump doesn't win a second term, what are we looking at? It's a throwback to the traditional US foreign policy?
Absolutely no way to determine that, except to say that I think there are enough institutional changes that are taking place that it's not that a new person comes and you just kind of rewind the clock and go back to a Obama, post-Obama period. I think this will take time and...
No, okay, so Elliot Cohen just wrote an article in The Atlantic where he really dissed the US Navy for actually trying to sort of put a top over the name of John McCain, USS John McCain. And he said, this is, when you do this, then you lose your honor. So are you saying that that's a kind of thing that cannot be reversed or something?
No, those things can be. But look, I mean, the US system is institutional. So the good thing is that it runs on institutions, not whims. But on the other hand, when you have a judiciary that you appoint in the US system, they are lifelong for the most part, right? Yeah. Hundreds of judges are appointed by the president or an administration. Yeah. That's a bent. Supreme Court. Which way does it go? It depends on those rulings where immigration goes. Right? Where immigration goes depends on where foreign policy goes. I mean, all of this is linked. So I think people who say this is a man, you take the man, things will go where they were, I don't agree with that. I mean, I think the US is a very strong system. It remains strong. It's institutional. You know, it's akin to the Pakistani military. It's an institution. So you remove one person, bring in one person, the institution doesn't change. So the flip side of that is, if you bring in changes in an institution, you can't just change a person and, you know. So I think this is going to last. Yeah, some people will try and reverse it. By the way, let me also put it out there. Even if there's a different result in the next election, it's not a given that you'll go left.
Yeah.
I mean, this could go in. We just don't know. It's too early.
Absolutely. Thank you, Moeed. It's always a pleasure to have you on the program. This is all for today. We shall see you tomorrow. Until then, it's goodbye.